You know, there's this idea that people have a conscience. And you know what the conscience is. It's this feeling or voice you have in your head just before you do something that you know is stupid, telling you that probably you shouldn't do that stupid thing. You don't have to listen to it, strangely enough. But you go ahead and do it anyways, and then, of course, exactly what the conscience told you was going to happen inevitably happens, so that you feel even stupider about it than you would if it happened by accident. Because you know, I knew this was going to happen, I got a warning it was going to happen, and I went and did it anyways. And the funny thing too is that conscience operates within people, and we really don't understand what the hell that is.
Jordan Peterson says, we don't know what the conscience is. I think a lot of psychologists and sociologists and scientists would say the same thing. Some might even deny the human conscience altogether. But what is the human conscience? Thankfully, as Catholics, we have the magisterium of the Catholic Church, along with scripture and tradition, to explain to us what the human conscience is. In this video, I'll talk about the conscience, referencing mainly the Catechism of the Catholic Church. If you like this content, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe and leave some comments. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks. Let's get started. Let's begin by asking, what is the human conscience? In Gaudium et Spes, Vatican II put it this way: deep within his conscience, man discovers a law which he has not laid upon himself, but which he must obey. His voice, ever calling him to love and to do what is good and to avoid evil, sounds in his heart at the right moment. For man has in his heart a law inscribed by God. His conscience is man's most secret core and his sanctuary. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. The law that is laid upon man is the natural moral law which is implanted in human nature. It's a law proper to human nature and recognized by reason. That's why it's called the natural moral law. It's the law God has written on the human heart. It's therefore universal in scope across mankind. For example, everyone knows it's wrong to murder, steal, lie, and commit adultery, etc. We do not need to be taught by others that these activities are wrong, although education is really important, because the precepts of the moral law are inscribed within us by God. Additionally, the law we must obey includes divine law in the deposit of faith, such as what is revealed by Christ in the Scriptures. For example, Jesus said, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." This law prohibits divorce and remarriage. While this is a moral law articulated by Jesus, it's also recognizable by reason as a tenet of the natural moral law. In paragraph 1777, the Catechism of the Catholic Church refers to the conscience as the moral conscience, because it pertains to what is moral and moves us to avoid evil and do the good. Moral conscience, present at the heart of the person, says the Catechism, enjoins him at the appropriate moment to do good and to avoid evil. It also judges particular choices, approving those that are good and denouncing those that are evil. It bears witness to the authority of truth in reference to the supreme good to which the person is drawn, and it welcomes the commandments. When he listens to his conscience, the prudent man can hear God speaking. The conscience bears witness to the supreme good. In the Catechism, that word is capitalized, signifying God. The conscience bears witness to the supreme good, who is God himself. It bears witness to what is morally true, and of course the moral law flows from God because he is the divine legislator and lawgiver. If you ever wonder if God speaks to you, he certainly does within the depths of your conscience. In fact, John Henry Cardinal Newman said that the conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. In a manner of speaking, the voice of Christ sounds in our conscience. Of course, it's necessary to be interiorly present to yourself and attentive, in contrast to being immersed in and overtaken by distractions or hardened by habitual sin, which tends to blunt or blind the conscience to some degree. We'll talk more about that later. In paragraph 1778, the Catechism goes on to say, conscience is a judgment of reason whereby the human person recognizes the moral quality of a concrete act that he is going to perform, is in the process of performing, or has already completed. That's an important statement, so let's unpack it some. The conscience is a judgment of reason about the moral nature of our activities. It's not about feelings, because feelings come and go, are based on emotions, and are unreliable in terms of making moral judgments. For instance, you might feel hesitant to upset a friend by pointing out that he's violating the moral law and harming himself and others, and perhaps placing his soul in peril. You might feel like you don't want to hurt his feelings or make him uncomfortable. If you simply follow these feelings and let them govern your actions and decisions, you might refrain from speaking out when you ought to do so for your friend's benefit. However, a moral judgment of reason comes to a different conclusion. A real, authentic love for a friend demands that I seek his true benefit, which includes, above all, helping him attain salvation, as well as a concern for helping him to understand what is truly good and what is not, that he may point his life toward God. With a judgment of reason, I know that there are times when I must speak up, even if it means risking upsetting my friend. Another example might be a father whose adult son is committing serious crimes, and even after the father admonishes him and warns him to stop, he continues with his criminal activities. The father loves his son, of course, and wishes that his son was not doing these things. And he might feel repulsed at the idea of turning his son into the police because he knows it's going to be unpleasant and painful. However, a judgment of reason concludes that this father must report his son's criminal activities to the police. Doing so is the morally right thing to do. It's for the benefit of all, for his son, for other people, and for society in general. As the Church teaches in the Catechism, there may be times when we have a responsibility to hinder the sins of others. When and how that should be done depends on the circumstances. Again, the conscience is a judgment of reason about the moral nature of our activities. It includes a judgment about what we have done or have not done and should have done in the past. It also includes a judgment of reason about what we ought not to do or must do in the present, as well as what we're planning to do or not do in the future. For example, if you did something you ought not to do in the past, a judgment of reason and an upright conscience will alert you to the fact that you've done wrong and violated the moral law. As a result, you feel guilty for the wrong you've done. Consequently, if you're in your right mind, so to speak, you will repent, seek God's mercy, and attempt to correct what you did wrong. An example is returning stolen property. We also make judgments of reason about our interior thoughts and desires. For example, am I guilty of lusting in my heart? Have I entertained an evil desire to inflict bodily harm on a neighbor who offended me? Is hate for another race the problem? The point is, we can be morally blameworthy for entertaining evil thoughts and desires. Jesus had something to say about that in Matthew's Gospel. You've heard that it was said, you should not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Next, given that the conscience is a judgment of reason about the moral nature of our activities, what is this judgment based on? As the Catechism tells us, it's based on the principles of morality. In other words, the principles of the moral law. Everyone has the general capacity to make judgments about what is right or wrong. The capacity to perceive the principles of morality and judge what is right or wrong is called synderesis. For example, one of the primary precepts of the moral law is the prohibition against murder. Everyone has the capacity to judge that murder is wrong. We know through reason that it is wrong because it is the unjust killing of a human person and therefore violates human dignity. Murder contradicts a person's right to life and human flourishing. As a result, it violates the natural moral law that is embedded in all men. But we all know that people have different opinions about what is right or wrong and make different judgments in particular situations. Think for a moment about a young person who grew up without any Christian upbringing and very little moral formation. Given today's culture, which touts the use of contraceptives to avoid pregnancy as a reasonable, good, and normal thing to do, it is likely that this person will use contraceptives in marriage to avoid pregnancy, even if only for a few years. This person may have no idea that the use of contraceptives is wrong, and he or she may not even think to look into the question. He or she will likely judge their use as a good thing to do. However, the use of contraceptives to prevent pregnancy is objectively wrong, and we can know this without even bringing religion into the question, because it's an aspect of the natural moral law that can be discerned through reason. Obviously, this person's conscience judged the use of contraceptives to be good, or at least not the wrong thing to do. But the use of contraceptives to avoid pregnancy is morally wrong. This highlights an important fact. One's conscience is fallible. It can be in error. The question is this person morally blameworthy for using contraceptives? The answer is probably not. He or she is likely innocent of the facts. This is what is called invincible ignorance. Invincible ignorance means that a person makes a wrong moral judgment through no fault of his own. He could not have reasonably known better. In his book, Introducing Moral Theology, William Madison provides an example of breaking the speed limit to illustrate invincible ignorance. Suppose you get pulled over for doing 45 in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. We are all required to obey the speed limit and will get a ticket for exceeding it. However, you're shocked that you are accused of speeding. You were watching for speed limit signs, driving alertly and responsibly, and the last sign you saw placed it at 45 miles per hour. Of course, saying, "I didn't know I was speeding," is probably not going to do any good. Later, you drive back down the road and find that the 30-mile-per-hour speed limit sign was knocked down and laying in the weeds. You couldn't have seen it, and there were no other indications that the speed limit was reduced to 30. Are you blameworthy for speeding? No, you're not. You could not have known better. Even so, you were speeding. This example helps us to see how our conscience can be in error through no fault of our own, in which case we are not morally blameworthy. In other words, we can have an erroneous conscience that is innocently ignorant of its error. Even so, when we do wrong, we're still doing wrong. Even in cases of invincible ignorance, moral evil is still done when we judge and act wrongly. It's just that we're not morally responsible for the wrong judgment. If it's true to say that some actions are objectively wrong, then they remain wrong, even if we don't judge them to be wrong. In terms of invincible ignorance, the Catechism says this in paragraph 1793. If the ignorance is invincible, or the moral subject is not responsible for his erroneous judgment, the evil committed by the person cannot be imputed to him. It remains no less an evil, a privation, a disorder. One must therefore work to correct the errors of moral conscience. In other words, even if we don't know we are acting morally wrong, damage still occurs if we do. Evil is still done, which is why we must take care to educate ourselves morally. I'll talk more about that later. On the other hand, there is what is called vincible ignorance. This means that a person is at fault for his ignorance of the moral law. In other words, he is guilty for his ignorance. To return to the speeding example, suppose you were driving but deliberately not paying much attention. You know that you need to watch for speed limit signs, but take little trouble to do so. Again, you get pulled over for doing 45 in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. It's not the case that the 30-mile-per-hour sign was knocked down. It was there in plain sight. It's just that you didn't see it. You might say, I didn't know I was speeding. And that may be true. But are you responsible? Yes, because you took little care to pay attention and watch for signs. You neglected your responsibility. You were driving carelessly. You could have and should have known better. Yes, you were ignorant of the facts, but this ignorance can be attributed to your lack of concern for the speed limit. In this case, you would be morally blameworthy. So, vincible ignorance entails ignorance of the moral law through one's own fault. Speaking about vincible ignorance and wrong judgments, in other words, one is guilty for his ignorance, the Catechism says this in paragraph 1791. This ignorance can often be imputed to personal responsibility. This is the case when a man takes little trouble to find out what is true and good, or when conscience is by degrees almost blinded through the habit of committing sin. In such cases, the person is culpable for the evil he commits. Just to say one thing about this, the Catechism states that the conscience can become almost blinded through the habit of committing sin. Sin tends to blunt the conscience and disfigure it or disform it. It causes a lax conscience. In other words, we do not feel guilty when we ought to feel guilty. Jeremiah chapter 6 talks about this when it says, "Were they ashamed when they committed abomination? No, they were not at all ashamed. They did not know how to blush." Let's look at things from another angle. Suppose your conscience is certain about some moral judgment. Let's say it involves watching television or movies. Let's suppose that you judge doing this to be morally wrong, period. In your view, you must not do so ever because you are sincerely convinced that it is sinful. And you are certain that you are right about this. Now, watching movies is not necessarily morally wrong or sinful. Even so, the question is, must you follow your conscience? The Catechism provides this answer in paragraph 1790. A human being must always obey the certain judgment of his conscience. Underline that word certain. If he were deliberately to act against it, he would condemn himself. Yet it can happen that moral conscience remains in ignorance and makes erroneous judgments about acts to be performed or already committed. The example of watching television is a bit extreme, but you get the point. If we are certain that some activity must not be done, then we must follow the dictates of conscience and not do it. On the other hand, if we are certain that we must do something, then we must do it. If we deliberately act against a certain conscience, we condemn ourselves, as the Church teaches. So we must act in accord with a certain conscience. Even so, we must remember that it's possible for the conscience to make wrong judgments. Another condition of conscience is called a doubtful or uncertain conscience. What does this mean? It means you are not sure about what the right or wrong thing is in a particular situation. You're doubtful about what the right moral choice is and what to do. This can often happen with complex moral questions. An example might be end-of-life decisions, such as whether it is right or wrong to remove a person from life support. When our conscience is doubtful or uncertain, we should always educate it with the relevant information before acting. Let's look at an example. Suppose you're a deer hunter in the woods. You see a bush move, hear something that sounds like it might be a deer, and notice a dark shape behind a bush. You think it might be a deer, but you are not certain about whether it is. Should you fire your rifle? No. First, you need to determine whether it's a deer or something else, like a bear or a person. You must do that before firing. If our conscience is doubtful about a moral judgment we are faced with making, we should always educate it before acting. If we deliberately neglect to do so and are morally careless, then we may well be responsible for morally bad behavior. Again, it should be clear that our conscience and judgments of reason can be in error. The Catechism says this about some of the causes of these errors in paragraph 1792. Ignorance of Christ and his gospel, bad example given by others, enslavement to one's passions, assertion of a mistaken notion of autonomy of conscience, rejection of the Church's authority and her teaching, lack of conversion and of charity. These can be at the source of errors of judgment in moral conduct. This brings us to another important fact. We must form or educate our conscience. Doing so is a lifelong project because new situations often arise in which we are uncertain about what the correct moral choice is. On the other hand, it might involve something we have thought we were sure about, but nevertheless realize we've not really looked into carefully. Once we become aware that we should look into a particular moral question that applies to decisions we have made or are making, then we should indeed consult legitimate sources of moral authority to ensure correct judgments are made. It is often the case that people allow their conscience to be formed by faulty sources, cultural norms, information on social media, the entertainment industry, and politicians often put forth bad moral examples. Even family members, friends, and coworkers can be suspect. They may be ignorant of the moral law on important questions and matters. It's not uncommon at all to find young women who are convinced abortion should be legal because their mother also thought the same. There are many examples of people receiving flawed moral formation from perceived sources of authority. In other words, have we formed our conscience through legitimate sources of moral authority? Or, on the other hand, have we all too easily allowed ourselves to develop a moral code from flawed sources, in which case our moral judgments may well be wrong? With that in mind, what are the primary legitimate sources of moral authority? Which sources should we turn to first that are reliable and certain in order to form our conscience? After all, we need to know what is really morally true. That should be clear. It's necessary to live well. It's necessary to point our lives toward God. What sources should we turn to in the first place? The primary sources of moral authority are sacred tradition, Scripture, and the teaching of the magisterium of the Catholic Church. Obviously, the Catechism is a go-to source. Beyond these, we can also turn to trusted and wise advisors who have moral training in the area of concern. But in that case, we have to be cautious and make sure that whatever advice they give does indeed line up with the primary sources I just mentioned. Again, it's essential to take the formation of conscience seriously, and it's a lifelong project. We are never really done with it, not in this life. Additionally, the life of prayer and building virtue is indispensable. Thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Be sure to like this video and subscribe and leave some comments. Thanks again for watching, and God bless you all.